I have always loved sports, but I never understood how much sports shaped my understanding of the world until I'd already finished my bachelor's degree. I had a master's degree, and I was halfway through a Ph.D. program in U.S. history. And that's when everything changed. I was in a bookstore, and I noticed a cover of Sports Illustrated magazine. The first thing that caught my eye was the image. There was a young African-American boy on the cover. He was probably about 3 or 4 years old, and he looked up at the camera with the sadness on his face that was heartbreaking. The second thing that I noticed were the words in big, bold letters. "Where's Daddy?" This article focused on athletes who had children out of wedlock. There were 40 athletes mentioned in this article. 2/3 of them were African American or Latino. What stood out to me was this article placed sports at the center of a larger national conversation that was going on about the Black family in the mid-1990s. This article appeared around the 30th anniversary of the Moynihan Report on Negro families. This report, which offensively described Black families as too matriarchal and pathological, caused a lot of attention. It also appeared around the time where the country was debating welfare reform during the Clinton administration. Now, I was aware of this larger conversation, but when sports were placed at the center, I became invested. And as I was reading the article, it was like I was in a scene in a movie. You know that moment when the character realizes something, and then you begin to see flashbacks where all the times that thing had been true. And what I began to realize was that sports was frequently an entry point for me into larger national, political, and social conversations. That moment was so profound that I decided to devote my life and my career to using sports to have larger conversations about the relationship between race relations, African-American culture, and history. Now, when I began this work over 20 years ago, little did I know that I would end up with what I think is one of the coolest jobs in America as a curator of sports for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. One of the great things about working in a museum is you get to use objects to share lessons from history. And today, I want to share with you 3 objects that are in the museum's collection because I think they help us understand how important African American history has been to this country. The first object is the first object is the jockey silks worn by Marlon St. Julian at the 2000 Kentucky Derby. When Mr. St. Julian raced in the Kentucky Derby, the nation's most significant and important horse race, he became the first African American to participate in 79 years. This is an important historical tidbit because African Americans used to dominate horse racing. If you go back to the first Kentucky Derby, African Americans were the riders on 13 of the 15 horses. I put this in the gallery because it demonstrates how far back sports, race relations, and slavery are intertwined. One of the things that is important to remember is that all aspects of American society, politics, foreign policy, race relations, and even sports were shaped by the legacy of slavery. On many large plantations, African Americans were the horse trainers, the horse groomers, and the riders. This story is important because it reminds us that not all who were enslaved worked in cotton fields or in the big house as domestics. Indeed, there is a large number of skilled artists, artisans, and even sportsmen whose labor was also exploited. I put this in because the story of the jockeys reminds us of something the director of our museum always says, that there is nothing so awful as a people who've sacrificed so much and been forgotten. One of the chief tasks of a museum is to remember those stories that have been forgotten because they reveal uncomfortable truths. To remember those stories that cause us to confront how profoundly our country has been shaped by slavery. The second object I want to share with you is an image of a battle royale. A battle royale was a group boxing match, and it usually featured 8 to 10 African-American teenagers who were blindfolded, given only one glove, and were forced to fight until all of them were knocked out and only one of them was left standing. These fights were designed to be humiliating and demeaning. They were designed to suggest that African Americans couldn't box, that they couldn't participate in the sport known as the sweet science. Because boxing isn't like a street fight. You have to use strategy. It's based on skill. And it's often a place where you have to outthink your opponent. But these events were designed to mock the ideas that African American had the intelligence to box. Most African Americans who got their start in boxing from 1880 till about 1930 had to fight in these events, including champions like Jack Johnson and Tiger Flowers. I put this in the gallery because sometimes it's easy to omit moments of abuse and evil, but it's dangerous to do so. I put this in the gallery because I wanted to challenge the assumption that sports are always progressive, that sports are always ahead of society in race relations, when the reality is that sports have frequently been used to reinforce racist ideas. The next object I want to share with you is a pair of shoes, a pair of Nike shoes worn by LeBron James at a game here in Washington, D.C. in December 2017. He wore one white Nike shoe and one black Nike shoe, both with the word equality etched on the back. For me, this is an important item because what I try to do is to explain how the athletes who are engaged in social protests and the athletes who are engaged in social activism today are part of a much larger tradition of social protest among athletes. From Jack Johnson to Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, Wilma Rudolph, Muhammad Ali, and the women of the WNBA. There's been a long tradition of athletes using their power and influence to fight for social change. And one of the great things that our museum can do is to contextualize the contemporary moment and to place those athletes in that larger tradition. Yet it's incredibly important that we understand that today's athletes are using new tools, new tactics, and new approaches to fight for social equality. For me, by having a serious, robust discussion about how sports have shaped our society, I'm able to fulfill my mission, which is to use sports to share the lessons of history. It's my hope that by remembering, challenging assumptions, and contextualizing the contemporary moment, that our museum is able to live up to the words uttered by President George W. Bush at the grand opening ceremonies of our museum. In regards to race relations, President Bush shared that he hoped that our museum would inspire us to go farther and get there faster. Thank you.